This is your mainstream media coming up with completely unhinged conspiracy theories. So Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting did a great analysis of, well, they always do great stuff, did a great analysis of the corporate media and how they dealt with the college campus protests, which were some of the biggest anti-genocide protests in the United States, were these college campus protests. The way Fairness and Accuracy Reporting does it is they look over like thousands of hours of footage. They check to see what it covered, what it said of the mainstream media, of cable news. And they found that what did cable news do to discredit these protests? Corporate media pushed conspiracy theories to discredit student protests. And this also, I love covering stuff like this because when they were pushing the conspiracy theory of Russiagate, and many indie media people, etc., said Russiagate's bullshit, they called us nutbags, right? How can you say Russiagate's? And it's all false. It's all collapsed. It's all crumbled. There was nothing to Russiagate. Nothing. And look, I hate Donald Trump. He is a repulsive human being. But there was nothing to Russiagate. And I'm not going to go through it again because it takes hours and I've done it endlessly. And yet we were called insane as they pushed that, as the mainstream media and the government pushed that utterly baseless conspiracy theory. So here is the conspiracy theories that these networks push. Across corporate media, journalists and pundits introduce conspiracy theories to discredit the pro-Palestine student protest movement, particularly that they are funded by foreign countries or outside agitators. MSNBC's Joe Scarborough went on a rant about the college students who have been staging the protests, suggesting to guest Hillary Clinton, isn't she just wonderful? Aren't you glad that Hillary Clinton's still in the public eye? Aren't you glad that we're still turning to Hillary for advice on how to run the world? Isn't that great? I'm just so glad she hasn't, walked off into the sunset. I'm just so happy she and Bill haven't Thelma and Louise it off a cliff somewhere. So happy she's still around and still respected. He went off on a rant and he said, I'm going to talk about radicalism on college campuses, the sort of radicalism that has mainstream students getting propaganda, whether it's from their professors or whether it's from communist Chinese government through TikTok. Dude, even the FBI has said that China has done nothing with TikTok. The FBI and the CIA and the intelligence agencies said all of the China TikTok scary idea is theoretical. There's absolutely been no Chinese propaganda on TikTok. It continues, calling the president of the United States genocide Joe. What? Why would you do that? Is it because he ships missiles to commit a genocide every 36 hours? Is that why you did it? Is that it? Calling you, meaning Hillary Clinton, and President Clinton war criminals. What? Why would anyone ever do that? Clinton responded, you raise things that need to be vented about. Yeah, I'm sure she's really wants you talking about that. So Scarborough then claimed that Qatar funds the students. Qatar, the country, is funding the student protests in the United States. His analysis that Qatar funds the protests likely comes from the Jerusalem Post, which I just told you a minute ago that it's Israeli propaganda. Jerusalem Post article, which called the protest despicable. The story reported, quote, Qatar has invested $5.6 billion in 81 American universities since 2007, including the most prestigious ones, Harvard, Yale, Cornell, and Stanford. Okay, Qatar invested in U.S. universities. How does that mean they funded the protests again? Oh, it doesn't at all. Of course, funding universities is not the same as funding student protests. The university administrations that actually receive the Qatari funding have often been quite hostile to the protesters. The people receiving the funding from Qatar were actually the ones having the students arrested. So really, Qatar was funding the arrests of the students in a tangential way. And instead, we're told they're funding the students as if the Qatar funding that went to the university. Like, that's how funding a university went. Like, I went to the University of Virginia. When I went to UVA, as if, like, every day someone came up to me and said, hey, Saudi Arabia just donated to the university, so here's a check. It's $1,000. Yeah, just go to town. You know, you were going to get that kegerator. Get 2. Get 7. Here's $1,000 from Saudi Arabia. Yeah, that's exactly how that worked. House Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, also another one that, can I just say, I'm so happy she's still respected and loved, and just I'm so happy we're still going to her for truth and advice on how this world should run. It just warms the heart, doesn't it? It warms the heart. It really does. I would say, if I'm honest, I think it a little bit does warm the fart. There could be that. Every time I hear Nancy Pelosi's name, it does warm my fart. That might have been a kindergarten joke, but I'm still happy with it. I am down with that joke. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi suggested on CNN State of the Union that Russia has played a role in the protests. Obviously, of course, Russia. Nancy Pelosi's blamed everything on Russia. Nancy Pelosi, I saw her stub her toe once, and she goes, Russia! She said, quote, what we have to do is try to stop the suffering and gossip. But for them to call for a ceasefire is Mr. Putin's message. To stop committing genocide is Putin's message. Actually, if that were true, if what Nancy Pelosi just said, calling for a ceasefire during a genocide is Putin's message, then wow, I guess people should be on Putin's side. If that's true, you're a lunatic if you're not siding with Putin. She just made Putin sound awesome. Putin wants to end genocide? God, I guess he's much cooler than I ever could have imagined. Who knew? She continues, I think some of these protesters are spontaneous and organic and sincere. Some, I think, are connected to Russia. I have no evidence of this. They're just clear. It must be Russian. CNN's Dana Bash asked, do you think some of these protests are Russian plants? Pelosi responded, I don't think they're plants. I think some financing should be investigated. So Russia's funding the protesters, which let me tell you, it just costs tons of funding to have a guy stand up in a quad and yell. Because, you can't get anyone to do that, especially against a genocide for free. No one would ever do that for free, right? No one would ever show up in their college and say, stop murdering children, guys. Can we do that? No one would ever say that without a lot of funding. It takes me, listen, if you want me to say no to a genocide, $1 million minimum. Oh yeah, no one would ever do that for free. Fox News also pushed the narrative, suggesting that China is behind the protests. Quote, China may be playing a significant role in the anti-Israel protests by using TikTok to foment division on college campuses. And by the way, TikTok banned me for talking about Gaza and genocide. So I'd really only been using it for 2 months, and they banned me with no right to appeal and no reason. But I was mainly talking about Gaza, so it's because I was talking about Gaza. So the idea that TikTok is turning people against this genocide, even though they're banning people who talk about the genocide, is kind of amazing. In a story headlined, Campus Protests Giving Russia, China, and Iran Fuel to Exploit the U.S. Divide, the New York Times described, quote, overt and covert efforts by the countries to amplify the protests. This is the New York Times. The story included some speculation about foreign influence. Quote, there is little evidence, at least so far, that the countries have provided material or organizational support to the protests. I always love this when the New York Times will cover something that's completely conspiratorial. Like, oh, these protesters are funded by these other countries. And then they'll throw in a little sentence saying, we have no evidence of that. There's no evidence of the things we're saying. I mean, could you, who can do, if you're a journalist, who can do that? Who can just be like, reporting live from Texas, space aliens have come here and they've entered Ted Cruz's anal cavity, and they are now controlling Ted Cruz specifically from the anus. We have no evidence yet of said claims, but I'm reporting live here in Texas. You would be a lunatic. How can you report on something and say there's no evidence of it? It's just absolutely hilarious. New York City Mayor Eric Adams, always a lovely man. Always. It's always good to take someone who was, an important figure in one of the largest fascist military forces on the planet, meaning the U.S. Police system. Take them and then just put them in as mayor of a city. What could go wrong? When someone's been spending 20, 30 years just harassing people, arresting mainly homeless people, pointing guns at people that are unarmed. And you go, I bet he'd run a city well. I bet he'd just do gangbusters at making sure the soup kitchens are running well. He's done such a good job arresting people of color around this city that I bet he'd do a great job making sure the sports stadium is kept clean. But why? Anyway, Eric Adams was an early source of the claim that outside agitators were actually the bad guys at the protests. He said that Columbia students had been co-opted by professional outside agitators. No one could just be against genocide, right? It must come from the outside. No student could just decide they're against genocide. CNN's Anderson Cooper asked the Anti-Defamation League. By the way, Anti-Defamation League is just a pro-Israel front. It's an Israel lobby bullshit. So anytime you see ADL, you hear about ADL. Actually, they used to have Zionist in their name. When they were founded, Zionist was in the name of the organization. And then they realized that was a bit on the nose. And so then they changed it to Anti-Defamation League. So the head of the Anti-Defamation League said, how many of them are actually students? A lot of them are not students, with no evidence of that. He said, you can't even tell who's an outside agitator and who's an actual student. CNN senior political commentator David Axelrod and former campaign manager to Barack Obama tweeted, it will be interesting to learn how many of those arrested in Hamilton Hall at Columbia are actually students. Maybe they aren't actually students and they're just, some sort of trolls, some sort of little evil demons that have taken over the university. So this is when they get to the real conspiracy. Some news outlets alleged that student protesters are funded by George Soros. Now, here's the thing. George Soros, not a good guy, right? Funds a lot of really sketchy stuff. I'm not here to defend George Soros. That is not my point. My point is how insane it is to say George Soros, a well-known Zionist, is funding anti-Zionist protests. And in case anyone needs a reminder, no, Zionism does not mean Judaism. I'm Jewish, I'm anti-Zionist. There's millions of anti-Zionist Jews around the world. Thank you for coming to this PSA. Some news outlets blame George Soros. For example, Fox News reported that a group that funds National Students for Justice in Palestine received a donation from an unnamed nonprofit that is funded by Soros. Fox was apparently referring to the Tides Foundation, a philanthropy that Soros has given money to. Tides gave money to the WESPAC in Westchester, New York, which is a peace group that serves as a financial sponsor for National Students for Justice in Palestine. So it's like 3 steps removed, students on college campus, then a pro-Palestine group that got money from another group, that got money from a group that is partially funded by Soros. So it's like 4 steps removed, and yet that proves that the students are not genuine and are funded by apparently a Zionist. In standard conspiratorial reasoning, this 3 times removed connection means that as Fox News put it, protests attended by SJP members are backed by dark money and liberal mega donor George Soros. The New York Post published a similar piece headlined, George Soros is paying student radicals, which is so not true, who are fueling nationwide explosion of Israel-hating protests. This is your mainstream media coming up with completely unhinged conspiracy theories, and yet they call people like me conspiracy theorists. This shows you just how much garbage our mainstream media is involved in. It's absolutely amazing.